Now it is my great pleasure to introduce a wonderful employee of James A. Garfield National Historic Site who's going to be doing this talk today. Alan Gephardt has been with us for the last 9 years and came to us originally from Baltimore, Maryland, and liked Northeast Ohio so much that he moved here. So we're proud to say that Alan is an adopted Northeast Ohioan, as am I. I liked it so much I moved here too. So it's a great place to live and a great place to work. And we are really pleased and honored to have Alan doing this program for us today. I can tell you nobody on our staff works harder or does more in-depth research than Alan Gephardt. So I think the program that you're going to hear here for the next 45 minutes or an hour is not only going to be fascinating, but is probably going to be one of the best researched and best presented programs you're going to see in this series. So without further ado, yeah, there we go. That's right. Nobody saw that, of course. I'll get that later. Besides, you were about 20 short. Okay, so having said that, please welcome Alan Gephardt.
Thank you very much, Todd, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. And I do want to thank the Mentor Public Library, because all these talks that I do, I rely on this library for sources. And I get a lot of things through interlibrary loan. And so I'm actually going to try to plug some of the books that I've used in this research today. So the title of this talk is Thomas Nast and Joseph Kepler, The Art of Political Cartooning in the Post-Civil War Era. So on the left, we see an image drawn by Thomas Nast on the occasion of President Lincoln's assassination. You see his biard there, and you see this allegorical figure of the United States, Columbia. And Columbia was the representation of the United States in many, many cartoons throughout the late 19th century. Eventually, she was supplanted by Uncle Sam, but in the 19th century, she is a very familiar image of the United States, or representation for the United States. This is a bit of a detail, much more of a detail on the right there. That is a drawing by the artist Thomas Kepler. And we see there James Garfield in clerical garb, and you'll see the full image later on in this talk. So, to begin, lithography. Lithography, developed at the end of the 19th century, made the art of cartooning possible. But in the early decades of this relatively new process, realistic portraits were most often used. Currier and Ives produced many political cartoons featuring realistic figures, and so I'll just go through a few of them here. Left to right, John C. Fremont, Millard Fillmore, and James Buchanan. Again, they're all very realistic. They're not very caricatured images of those three men who ran for president in 1856. Franklin Pierce, again, realistic image of the 1852 presidential nominee, Democratic Party. Realistic image of his face. Look at his body. Look at the images around him. It's rather comical. And then we see again 1860, the four major presidential candidates that year were John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, again not caricatured, Stephen Douglas. There's James Buchanan, the sitting president, John Breckinridge, the vice president, candidate of the Democratic Party, and of course Abraham Lincoln. All very realistic portrayals of those gentlemen. And this continues on for quite some time. The most important figure in 19th century American cartooning, during the Civil War period at least, is Thomas Nast. And we see him there on the left. He was a dogmatic person, content to view the world as a struggle between good and evil. And consequently, his work was often very caustic and lecturing. He used very heavy black lines in a lot of his work. And we're going to be seeing some examples of that. He was born in Landau, Germany on September 27th, 1840. His father, Joseph, migrated to America in 1845, and the following year, Thomas arrived in New York City with his mother and his older sister. He could not speak a word of English at that time, but he was drawing by the age of 6. Early in his teens, he attended the National Academy of Design in New York City, but in 1856, he had to go to work. One day, he went to the offices of Frank Lesley, the publisher of Frank Lesley's illustrated newspaper. And after drawing a picture for Lesley, he got a job on the paper with a salary of $4 a week. Later, he was hired at $40 a week by the New York Illustrated News. That was 1859. He covered the funeral of John Brown, the noted abolitionist who had attacked Harper's Ferry, and then he traveled to England to cover a well-publicized prize fight between an American and an Englishman. By 1862, however, he was drawing sketches relating to the war for Harper's Magazine. And so we see on the right side of this slide a very, very famous drawing for the period, very well publicized. It's called A Gallant Flag Bearer. This was a time, the 1860s, the Civil War period, when the public greatly enjoyed heavily illustrated publications. Frank Leslie's was one, Harper's was another. And if you've ever seen reproductions of these magazines, you know what I'm talking about. They have lots and lots of images, very, very highly detailed imagery in them. Here we see one called The War in the Border States, and another that shows aerial ballooning that was conducted during the war. This is a sketch, and Nast later drew a more formal cartoon using that. And then again, we have this, A Christmas Furlough. It added a great deal to Nast's fame. This was a very, very popular image during the war. It's very romantic. Nast received letters from many people for the sentimental images that you see in this illustration. And Abraham Lincoln commented during the war that Nast was the Union's greatest recruiting sergeant because of his illustrations. We see here the Battle of Fredericksburg Heights. This was a very effective cartoon done by Nast in 1864, Compromise with the South. It was drawn at the time of the Democratic Convention in 1864, and it shows Jefferson Davis shaking hands with a figure that represents a soldier that represents the North, right, over a tombstone representing the Union dead. And again, we see this figure of Columbia weeping, United States weeping. And this was a very effective cartoon used in 1864 and may have influenced a lot of people to vote for Lincoln and not to tarry with anybody who said we should compromise with the South, as many Democrats were saying at that time. Another candidate who would benefit from Nast's pencil was Ulysses S. Grant. And we see Grant in this illustration facing his 1868 opponent, Governor of New York, Horatio Seymour. Look at Grant. There's a very, very natural image of him, a realistic image of him. And looking through many, many images that Nast drew of Grant, every single one of them is realistic. He never caricatured Grant, apparently. So he never made fun of him. He was Grant was a hero to Thomas Nast. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. But just, I think, you look here at his hair, and you get the idea. What he thinks of the Democratic candidate for 1868. And then we see also, and I think this is just, again, a good illustration. Here we see Nast beginning to move into caricaturing political figures. He had no use for Andrew Johnson. And even though Johnson's portrait is fairly realistic, the facial image of Johnson is fairly realistic. Look at his body. So you see we're playing with the form of the body, the proportions of the body, as opposed to the head. So again, an early form of caricaturing a political figure. Grant, by the way, noted at one point that it was Phil Sheridan's sword and Thomas Nast's pencil that made him President of the United States in 1868. Again, Nast greatly, let me go back Nast greatly admired Grant. They met socially on many occasions, and on one occasion, in a letter to his wife, Nast wrote this: "The president found out I was here in Washington and sent word he would like to see me. So I called on the president. I had a very pleasant chat with him about everything in general, and I was very much pleased with the open way in which he spoke to me. I was with him about an hour. When we got through, he asked me to come and dine with him and his family at 5 p.m. Bless you."
Thank you.
Okay. In 1872, Grant's opponent was New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley. He was the candidate of the liberal Republicans and the Democrats at the same time. And the liberal Republicans were a breakaway faction from the Republican Party. A lot of liberal Republicans were very dissatisfied with Grant's administration. There were these hints of corruption. Some of the policies of the Grant administration, liberal Republicans didn't agree with. For example, there's military rule in the South in that first administration of Grant. And there were liberal Republicans and there were others in the country who were saying this military rule isn't working, and what we need to do is try to figure out a different way to quell the violence in the South and bring the Democrats kind of back into the political fold so that we can end all the violence that's happening. And Greeley becomes the candidate of the liberal Republicans and again the Democratic Party. He was viewed as an eccentric person by many, dressed perennially in a flowing white coat and white hat, his round frame glasses and fringe of white hair and whiskers around his chin. And so you see how Nast portrayed him during the campaign. And then you see an actual image of Horace Greeley. This one, I think, is really fascinating. Horace Greeley is being portrayed the day after the election, carried away, dead. What I think is most striking about this image is that Horace Greeley's wife died the week before the election. Everybody knew this. Thomas Nast knew this, but it didn't stop Nast from drawing what I think you might think is a very insensitive image of the losing candidate that year, Horace Greeley. Just a real quick note, too. Horace Greeley himself died 3 weeks later. Okay. Nast is commonly credited with popularizing the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant. The donkey actually was represented by the Democrats as early as Andrew Jackson's presidency, but by the 1850s, the emblem of the Democratic Party is the rooster, as seen here in this banner for James Buchanan in 1856. Nast made the donkey the permanent symbol, really, of the Democratic Party with a cartoon right here. And we see the Democratic donkey kicking Edwin M. Stanton lion. Okay? Edwin M. Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, died in 1869, at the end of 1869. And so here's the Copperhead donkey kicking him. And that's the first major use by Nast of the Democratic donkey, kicking a dead lion, kicking a dead Republican, if you will. And here is an early use of Nast's Republican elephant. It's 1875. A lot of people are concerned that President Grant might run for a third term. And so he is accused of Caesarism. So there's that word right there, Caesarism. And what you have here is the Democratic donkey, right, in a lion's skin. Caesarism. Here's this huge elephant about to fall into this pit because, my goodness, the Republicans might nominate General Grant for a third term. The idea of a president running for a third term was very, very unpopular. Washington didn't do this, Jefferson didn't do this, and so forth. Jackson didn't do it. And Grant shouldn't do this. He shouldn't run for a third term. So there's this concern that the Republican Party is becoming a party that's been in power too long, Grant's been in power too long, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what we're going to see next is a lot of fun. Anybody recognize? Well, you can see, right? Just off the top, anybody recognize who this is supposed to be? Like, who was Boss Tweed, right? He's a New York political boss in the 1870s, and he had this ring of associates, and they basically robbed New York City. And Thomas Nast was determined, did I just lose my? Thomas Nast was determined to do him in politically. I think I did. There it is. Let me get that back. So we see this image of Boss Tweed as a money bag. And of course, you see that the caption is brains, right? Brains. That again continues this idea of Boss Tweed and his ring as a group of vultures feeding on the people of New York City. And he's a rotund figure, so we see this caricature of him based on his body type, very big, large man, prominent features of his face, accentuated. And this really did a lot of damage to Boss Tweed. William Tweed, he commented at one point, he wrote a letter, actually, he wrote a letter to Nast. Stop them damned pictures. I don't care so much what the papers say about me. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damned pictures. The destruction of the Tweed wing was national news in the early 1870s, and it led to jail terms for all the men who are portrayed in those cartoons. The next major figure in American cartooning in the late 19th century is Joseph Kepler. As Richard West said in his book, Satire on Stone, upon Thomas Nast's steel framework, all of his drawings were done on steel, etched in steel. On Thomas Nast's steel framework, Joseph Kepler hung a multicolored, dramatic vision of the great range of expression political cartooning could contain. Before Joseph Kepler and the news magazine Puck, cartoons appeared only in black and white. They were engraved on wood or steel. Kepler's colorful chromolithographs were made with stones. After Puck, eye-catching covers in vibrant colors, comic sections were not too far behind. After this, we start to see the comics come into play. But back to Joseph Kepler. He was a cake decorator in his youth, a theatrical scenery painter, and an actor before he became an artist drawing political cartoons. Like Nast, he was German, and he settled in a very German city in this country in the 1860s, St. Louis. The original Puck, how many of you are familiar with Puck magazine? Couple, handful. Well, you're going to become a little bit more familiar with it as we go through these slides today. The original Puck magazine was a German language publication. So let's see if I can take us to that illustration. So there it is. This is issue number 2 of the original Puck, and as you can see, the wording is in German. Now we begin also to think about a contrast here between Nast and Kepler in terms of their political affiliations. Again, Nast practically worshipped General Grant, and Kepler was not all that impressed. He hadn't been here during the Civil War, so he didn't really get it. Why people were so fascinated and so taken with General Grant. He'd come a few years after the war had ended, and he became an astute and persistent critic of Ulysses S. Grant. He disagreed with Grant's proposal to buy what is now the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. And he was bothered a lot by the scandals that came out during Grant's second term. So he drew this cartoon of Grant. So here's Grant, right, at the top of the trapeze, and he's holding all these men who were members of his cabinet or associates of his during his administration, and all of them had been accused of some form, and some of them were later convicted, of some form of political corruption. And so this is Joseph Kepler's take on Grant. Again, realistic image, but a very comical idea here, and the bodies of these men obviously not in proportion, and so you see that. Nast and Kepler became rival artists. So here is, in this early period before Puck, Kepler is working for Frank Lesley's, and Nast is working for Harper's Weekly. So Harper's is pro-Grant, and Lesley's is anti-Grant. Now we go a little bit forward again, and we see that the English version of Puck magazine comes along in 1876, and it is in color. It was heavily illustrated, it was highly opinionated, and it was very appealing to Americans of that day. So, throughout the 1870s, Nast continued to wave the bloody shirt to remind the nation of the Civil War and the injustices committed against blacks in the South. He continued to defend Ulysses S. Grant as a general, as a person, as a president. Nast, by contrast, critical of Grant, very supportive of President Hayes. Kepler is very supportive of President Hayes when President Hayes succeeds Grant. He's supportive of Hayes's efforts to withdraw troops from the South. He is supportive of civil service reform. And overall, he thinks that Grant's administration is a very honest one. And so what we see here, portrayed by Kepler, is President Grant as St. George, right, slaying the dragon of Southern misrule or Union misrule of the South. And once again, we see this allegorical figure of Columbia. I think it's also interesting to look at her. This is a very classical image of Columbia, right? Look at her. She's not wearing any clothes, right? So that's kind of daring, actually, in the late 19th century for him to have done that. But it was accepted. Here's Nast's take on President Hayes. The editor of Harper's was a man named George William Curtis. And he was very much a reformer, and he very much supported Hayes. And he wanted Hayes to be given a real chance to prove himself as president, prove his policies. Nast just disagreed. He thought that withdrawing troops from the South was a huge mistake. He thought that Hayes's efforts to reform the civil service was a slap at Grant. And he wanted to draw cartoons critical of Hayes. And George William Curtis wouldn't let him. There are no cartoons by Nast of Hayes. What Nast did then, he drew himself. And he's being sort of manhandled by Uncle Sam here, right? And give President Hayes a chance. So this is sort of his roundabout way of being somewhat critical of President Hayes without actually illustrating President Hayes in a cartoon. Pat is here. I don't know whether any of the rest of you are familiar with this, but at the top here, there's this phrase, watch and pray. And if you go to the Garfield home and you go to Eliza Garfield's bedroom, you will see a tapestry. I can't think of the right word. And it says, watch and pray. And this phrase, very popular in the 19th century. I just kind of like to point that out right now. All right. Sampler. There you go. Okay, and we've just gone through the anti-Hayes cartoon. Now, these artists, Nast and Kepler, they didn't just do political figures. They didn't just do presidents. So now we come to some illustrations that I think are pretty interesting, right? So Kepler again, and Nast, they drew a lot of cartoons reflecting the religious and ethnic stereotypes of the day. Various sects and various ethnic groups were portrayed by both men. Here we have Kepler and Nast. So what we have here is Nast, black and white, and the white fellow, of course, he's Irish. So there's a characterization of Irish according to Nast. And then we have Kepler's Irishman, and look at the byline here. Look here, you, everybody is quiet and peaceable, and you're all the time kicking up a row. So you see the German, he is asleep. The Russian, he is asleep. The Negro, he is asleep. But the Irishman, he's not. He's kicking up a row. So we get these stereotypes of these groups, and then this one, the Chinese. So you know the Chinese, this was a big issue in the 1870s and 80s. Chinese immigration on the West Coast. So it's hard to see, I know, but I want to read what we've got right here for you, okay? So you have a Chinese person and you have an Irish person being portrayed in those little insets there. And in the one that's kind of leaning to the left, it says, "The departing biddy to the Chinese usurper. Sure, it's Dennis Kearney." He was a California politician against Chinese immigration. "Sure, it's Dennis Kearney who'll see me roited, ya heathen Cheney." And then the one that's below, it's the Chinese road conductor. So they're on a streetcar. So the Chinese conductor, and he says, "Getty you out, you Irish heathen." So they're both calling each other heathens. So the Irish and the Chinese. So you see that, 19th century. And then we have the Catholic Church. I'm going to show you a couple on the Catholic Church here. State aid, government aid to Catholic education is a big issue in the 1870s in many states, including Ohio, by the way. And so you have these, defenseless Americans as these Catholic cardinals are coming across the water like crocodiles or alligators. That's Thomas Nast. And if I may say, I was raised Roman Catholic, so I feel comfortable showing you this. Yeah. And then there are the Mormons. Brigham Young died, right? And so here's Brigham Young's empty pillow and all of his wives. Again, Thomas Nast. What do you think? Are you surprised? How many are surprised? Not surprised. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. I want to make sure I don't get myself out of order here. Okay. And then this one I think is kind of fun too. Here's the Roman Catholic prelate, and here is the Mason. And they're attacking each other. And they're calling each other names. And they're calling each other frauds. So that's Thomas Kepler. And now we come to another idea that I want to kind of tease out here. The use of allegory, symbolism, in the late 19th century political cartoons. So throughout this period, late 19th century, allegory is used to treat political issues and figures. Bible stories, classical scenes, Shakespeare, fairy tales, historical personages or events, and personified concepts of justice, peace, and the United States in the guise of women were common. So the first one we're looking at here is Puck himself. So Puck, in the masthead of the magazine, you always saw the figure of Puck. And of course, Puck comes from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, right? And he's the symbol for human foolishness. So he's an allegorical figure himself. So Kepler created this image for the magazine. I mean, this is a satirical magazine. So here, right away, we see this allegorical figure of Puck, and he's always on the cover of the magazine, and he's often somewhere in the actual cartoon as well. So I just kind of blew him up there so you can see. So here and here, there's Puck. So he's an allegorical figure for human foolishness. And then we have an example of Shakespeare again being used by Thomas Nast on two different occasions. So here's General George McClellan. Those of you who are, I think, familiar with the Civil War, and I think most of you are, right, know that McClellan was one of Lincoln's generals, and they had a lot of disagreements. Well, McClellan's the 1864 Democratic nominee for president. And so we see McClellan as Hamlet, right? Poor Yorick, I knew him well. And then we see later on in the 1870s, here's Boss Tweed again as the character Falstaff. So using Shakespeare or Shakespearean characters or what have you to get across a point, to make some light of a political figure. This one I enjoy very much. General Winfield Scott Hancock is seen here. This is by Kepler. There's General Winfield Scott Hancock as Moses in the rushes. So why? It's 1880. General Hancock is the Democratic nominee for president running against James Garfield. The Democratic Party has not won a presidential election in 24 years. And so you know General Hancock's going to grow up and lead them out of the wilderness. There he is, Moses Hancock. And then I really like this one. This is by Thomas Nast. And this is, this is the 1870s. And I just think, I love this. Peace to justice. After you, madam. So, peace is inviting justice in. You can't have peace without justice. And I just, to me at least, this is a brilliant cartoon by Thomas Nast. And again, you see the allegorical figures, right, of peace and justice. You see women portrayed in these very lofty terms in this cartoon. Here's President Garfield, Vice President Arthur. Here's Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, with whom Garfield had a major political battle, which ultimately leads to Garfield's assassination. So why is Garfield dressed as a Roman Catholic cardinal, or actually Pope? The cartoon is the American Sixtus V. Now, I'll bet no one in this room has any idea who Sixtus V was. Does anybody? Okay, neither did I. So I looked him up. And to just make the point that the cartoon is making is that Sixtus V was elected Pope in 15-something. And he was, the story was, this is not true, but the story was that he portrayed himself as being a very weak and infirm man in order to get himself elected Pope. And then once he was elected Pope, suddenly he throws away his canes and he's this powerful man. Well, this is Garfield in 1881, because a lot of people said that Garfield was actually a weak person, that he can always see an issue, two sides of each issue, and he can't make up his mind, and he's weak, and he's not going to stand up to somebody like this blowhard Senator Conkling, but he did. And so he throws away his canes. Kepler did not have a lot of respect for James Garfield. James Garfield was involved in a couple of scandals in the 1870s involving relatively small amounts of money, but Kepler just thought this was terrible, that like all these other things that are coming out in during Grant's time as president, here we have Garfield kind of on the take a little bit as well. And so he didn't really have a lot of respect for James Garfield running up to James Garfield's presidency. And when James Garfield stood up to Senator Conkling, suddenly, Kepler says, maybe there's some hope after all. And so he draws this cartoon of a not weak Garfield, but a strong Garfield. And so that's the significance of it. But again, we're looking at a historical figure for the allegory for a political point being made. Thomas Nast drew this cartoon of Columbia weeping after President Garfield died. And there's a wonderful little poem here about how the country had hoped and hoped and hoped that Garfield would live. But in the end, death prevailed. But again, just, I think, a very touching tribute to President Garfield using the allegorical figure of Columbia weeping. The next major theme, I think, that we get to, particularly with Kepler and several of his associates, is the portrayal of male political figures in female clothing. This is done for laughs, in part. It might also have something to do with the idea that by dressing men in women's clothing, you get a different kind of an emotional response, maybe something that you're looking for that if you drew them more realistically, you wouldn't get. And then there's, I think, the controversy of women in the late 19th century arguing for suffrage and so forth, and wanting to become more manlike. So we see in this cartoon with President Hayes, this is Cinderella. So here's Cinderella, and here are her wicked stepsisters, General Grant and Senator Conkling. I'm just going to go through several presidents now, and then we go here, Hayes' successor. Here's President Garfield as a bride about to marry Uncle Sam, and some of the other figures in this image. There's Senator Conkling again, and this is Senator Logan from Illinois. This is a newspaper publisher, Whitelaw Reid, and this is another senator from Missouri, a fellow German of Kepler and Nast. His name was Karl Schurz. And then here's this man running in saying, wait a minute, I object, and this little baby is labeled 329. $329 is the supposed amount of money that Garfield was given for some stock in a railroad company, a dummy company that was set up. It was called the Crédit Mobilier scandal, and it was a big deal. And a lot of congressmen and senators were caught up in it. Garfield, this is in the early 1870s, Garfield denied that he had taken a bribe, in effect. It was very murky, but it comes back to haunt him in 1880 during the campaign. And so we see Garfield again dressed as a woman, and all these other men dressed as a woman.
Excuse me,
Yes?
the minister, I can't make out the figure of the minister.
Oh, it's the ballot box. It's the ballot box. Okay? Yeah, thank you for the interruption. I'm glad you asked that question. Anything else about this one? And by the way, anything about any of them so far? You can stop me at any point. This is called the Beauty Contest, or the Contest of Beauty. The Contest of Beauty, it's 1884. Here's President Arthur, Garfield's successor. Beautiful white dress, isn't it? Yes. Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts, he's a real fetch. This is James G. Blaine, a very prominent politician of the day. He was with Garfield when Garfield was assassinated. Here's President Hayes. Here is Senator Sherman, I believe. Where is Conkling? Conkling's in there. Oh, where's Conkling? He is in there. There he is. Look at him with his bare shoulders there. And there's Ulysses S. Grant, John Logan. And now we come to the successful Democratic nominee of 1884, Grover Cleveland. So it says, he courts the mother, right, and means the daughter. So this is the Democratic Party. Allegorical figure, Democratic Party. Here is Samuel Tilden, the unsuccessful 1876 Democratic nominee. He was still a factor in 1880 and in 1884. So, well, we have to consult with Tilden to make sure it's okay to go for Cleveland. And so Cleveland is portrayed here as a hardworking reformer. And all this material has to do with reform legislation that he had caused to be passed or that he had supported while he was the mayor of Buffalo and the governor of New York. So there he is. This is a setup. So this is a classical image. Let me go back to my notes to make sure I say all this right. The female figure disrobed in the center there is Phryne, and she is before the Areopagus. And so Phryne was a courtesan in ancient Greece, and she was brought before this court accused of impiety. She was disrobed, and you see that she's hiding her nakedness or trying to hide. She's ashamed. And so therefore, this is proof that she was innocent of being an impure person. I originally had notes here of who the original artist was, and I apologize. I didn't include them here on these notes that I'm looking at. Now, this portrait is used repeatedly in 1884. So again, we have several prominent Republican figures all lined up here. Who do I see? Logan is here. I'm surprised that Conkling isn't. I don't see Conkling. But anyway, several public figures. This is James G. Blaine. He was called the Tattooed Man. So, oh my gosh, all my tattoos. So what this is about, these are all his scandals. These are all his scandals. And so he's got to hide in shame because all of his scandals have been revealed. And you saw earlier in a cartoon I mentioned him, Whitelaw Reid, the publisher of the Tribune, the New York Tribune, and there he is, you see. So they've taken that classical portrait. This is by an artist named Gillam, one of Kepler's associates at Puck. They've taken that classical portrait and used it to make a political point.
The original was Jerome.
There it is, thank you. Jerome, that's right. Thank you so much. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Not much. I just had to look him up. I use
Oh, you cheated. Okay, all right.
How could I not find out?
I'm kidding. Okay. Now I'm going to conclude by doing a little diversion here. Many of you may not recognize this man's face or may know nothing about him, but he was a nationally prominent cartoonist, Frederick Burr, and he was born in Madison, as you can see here. And he was hired by Puck in 1880. And he, again, I've just kind of created it for you, known for his antitrust cartoons and a comic strip, Happy Hooligan. Anybody familiar with it at all? Happy Hooligan? Yeah, some of you know Happy Hooligan. Well, this is Frederick Burr, so born not too far from here. This is by Opper, and I just found this fascinating. Okay, it's 1881. It's the assassination of James Garfield. This is Charles Guiteau, walking pistol, and all these scenes talking about, my gosh, the proliferation of guns in our society and training up the youth to use guns. And then you get this crazy man. So I put that in not because I want to start a debate on gun control, because I don't. But I think that we can look back at something that's 136 years old and simply make the connection that certain political issues that we deal with today were current a long time ago as well. And we know that race and religion continue to be issues for us today, but this was an issue as well in the 1880s. So I just thought that was fascinating, and the fact that it is F. Upper. Okay. This is something else that Frederick Upper was known for. This is just one illustration of his series on Willie and the trusts. This is William McKinley. And here's Papa, the corporate trusts, who are going to tell him how to behave what to do. And again, we have Nursey, Marcus Hanna. So again, if you're from Ohio, you know the Hanna Theater in Playhouse Square. It's named for him. He is a big deal in late 19th century Ohio and national politics. Again, he's portrayed as a woman, right? But he had a great deal of influence, supposedly, on William McKinley. He certainly was a primary backer of McKinley's bids for the presidency in 1896 and 1900. This is a 1900 cartoon. I think I've written it down. If I haven't, I can certainly. I love it here. You know what he writes here. Yes, Willie. Here is a fine little boy and a fine little friend, and I have brought to play with you. Okay, treat him kindly, as he is rather timid. So a timid TR. What do you think? One of the first comic strips to be created, and it's by someone who started out as a political cartoonist. He was famous, Opper was famous for these really comical facial expressions, for the comical clothing, and his characters often had these rather gymnastic poses which they took in the course of the panels for the cartoon. Okay, so this idea of using allegory, of dressing men in women's clothing, of using fairy tales or what have you as backgrounds to a cartoon, as allegories in a cartoon, continues well into the 20th century. So there is Franklin Roosevelt, right? Mother Goosevelt. And what I think is fun is the bird here, right? So it's a blue bird that resembles the National Recovery Administration Blue Eagle from the early 1930s. Okay, so there you have it. I think we're done. So I hope that you've enjoyed just taking this survey of various political cartoons through the late 19th century, and got some ideas about the techniques that were used to make points political and also to lampoon political figures. Thank you for coming today. If you have any questions, let me know.